be stressful. And so I really do appreciate all of you still making this effort to come together and to recognize that there is nothing more important in our lives than coming together, assembling, and worshiping our God. And so that's encouraging me. I appreciate all of you being here. And with that being said, I hope the things I have for you tonight can be of some encouragement to you as well and help you in your Christian walk. If you have any questions about anything that's said, please come and find me afterwards. I'd love to talk to you about it. In 1 Kings 22, we are introduced to a scene in which we find the king of Judah, King Jehoshaphat, and the king of Israel, Ahab, allied together, preparing to go to war or battle to retake Ramoth-Gilead for the nation of Israel. And when we hear the name King Ahab, we all know what to expect, right? We know who King Ahab is. That's a name that stands out to us. Because why? Well, because King Ahab was a terrible dude. King Ahab's about as bad a king as it gets in Israel and Judah both, and it's hard to really think of someone worse than him besides maybe Manasseh. And so we know those things about him, but King Jehoshaphat, on the other hand, was not a bad man. King Jehoshaphat was a godly man, a God-fearing man, and being a God-fearing man, he does what a godly man would do by asking Ahab to inquire first for the word of the Lord in verse 5. Because he wants to ensure that what they're about to do, this battle they're about to undertake, it's going to be successful, but more importantly, it's going to be successful because God is with them. And so Ahab obliges him, and he calls together these 400 prophets, and he asks them, shall I go against Ramoth-Gilead to battle, or shall I refrain? And they said, go up, for the Lord will give it into the hand of the king. Now, I don't know about you, but if I just heard 400 people who claim to be prophets tell me that what I'm about to do is going to be successful, I think I'd be pretty confident in that, right? I think I'd have good feelings going into this battle. I'd have no hesitation, no fear whatsoever. But King Jehoshaphat was not me. And King Jehoshaphat instead asked Ahab again, is there not yet a prophet of the Lord here that we may inquire of him? And it is here that we find out exactly why Ahab called for these 400 false prophets rather than for a true prophet of God. In chapter 22, verse 8, King Ahab responds, there is yet one man by whom we may inquire of the Lord, but I hate him, because he does not prophesy good concerning me, but evil. He is Micaiah, son of Imlah. And this evening, I would like for us to study this man, Micaiah. Not a very common Bible character for us, not someone that we really talk about that much, but I want us to study this man and to view things about him and use him as our template for better understanding how we are to be evangelists in the world on God's behalf. And the very first thing that I notice about Micaiah is that he was a known prophet of God. You see, when King Jehoshaphat first asked Ahab to inquire of God, Ahab automatically calls these 400 men, and I like to call them his yes men, because as the name suggests, it doesn't matter what Ahab asked these guys right here, they were going to say yes. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered to them. All they wanted to do was please Ahab. Ahab could have come before them and said, should I build 50,000 idols throughout the land of Israel and make every Israelite worship them? And you know what those guys' answer would have been? Yes. That's who they were, because these people didn't care about pleasing God. They didn't care about Ahab's heart. All they cared about was pleasing Ahab so that they could keep their position within his kingdom. But Jehoshaphat sees through this. He saw through this, and he recognized that these men were not prophets of the one true God. And so he asked Ahab again to find me a real prophet, a real spokesperson of God, that we may truly understand what it is that God thinks about this. Now, in that time period, you would think that there'd be multiple people that came to Ahab's mind, right? There's a lot of prophets in the region at this time. You would think that Ahab could think of multiple guys who had come to him and opposed him and had gone against what he had to say, but that's not the case. And instead, one singular man comes to mind, Micaiah. Well, why? Why Micaiah? What had Micaiah done that made him stand out in Ahab's mind? Or more specifically, what had Micaiah not done that made him so prominent in Ahab's mind as a man of God? And Ahab tells us this in verse 8. It was because he does not prophesy good concerning me, but evil. Quite simply, the only reason that Ahab knew that Micaiah was a prophet of God was because he opposed him. Now, this speaks volumes, and we'll talk about that in a second. But if you know anything about Ahab, as we've just talked about, this shouldn't surprise you. A prophet of God coming to oppose him. And 1 Kings 16 tells us some of those reasons, and I'll read some of them for you. In verse 31 of 1 Kings 16, it tells us that Ahab served and worshipped Baal. Verse 33 tells us that he made the Asherah. And then the author of 1 Kings actually concludes this chapter in verse 33, saying that Ahab did more to provoke the Lord God of Israel than all the kings of Israel who were before him. And so as we see here, it's pretty understandable that Micaiah was constantly coming and criticizing Ahab and saying all these things and prophesying against him and opposing him. And the thing is, Ahab probably recognized this. In fact, Ahab did recognize this. Ahab knew that Micaiah was a prophet of God because of this, which you would think would speak to himself and help him to understand, maybe I need to make a change of heart. But you see, that's not who Ahab was. Ahab wasn't interested in having a change of heart. Ahab wasn't interested in having opposition. What Ahab wanted to hear was how great Ahab was. He wanted to be told that what he was doing was good, that God agreed with it. He didn't want opposition from anyone. The most important thing to him was being told that what he was doing was right. And so you see, what Ahab is really saying in verse 8 of this chapter, it's not that he hates Micaiah because Micaiah comes and prophesies against him all the time. The reason he hates Micaiah is because Micaiah is the one man in the world, or one of the few men in this world, who would come to Ahab's face and tell him what he needs to hear. He hated him because Micaiah told him the truth. That is how he knew that Micaiah was a prophet of God. And my question for you now is, are we doing this with the people around us in the world? Are we making it plainly obvious to our friends in the world or the people that we pass in our day-to-day lives that we're a person of God by telling them what God would have them to hear? Because I don't know about you, but I don't think I'm always doing a great job of this. And I'll give you an example, something that I think we can all relate to. Have you ever had somebody come to you and ask you, do you do this? Or why do you do this? I'll use specifics tonight. Have you ever had somebody come to you and say, do you drink alcohol? I don't know about you, but this has happened to me multiple times in college. If you had a friend, a classmate, a coworker, another parent come to you and ask you, hey, do you drink alcohol? Well, what should our answer to this be? What should be, well, no, I don't, because I'm a Christian. Because I think because God tells me that I shouldn't be drunk with wine and there's no reason for me to toe the line. I think that it's a sin. There's absolutely no reason for me to be drinking alcohol. But that's oftentimes not the answer that we give to people, is it? And instead, what we try to answer these questions with is something along the lines of, well, you know, I don't, but the reason for it's because it's kind of bad for you. It's bad for you. I've seen people put on a lot of pounds after they started drinking alcohol pretty heavily, so I don't want to do that. That's my reason. Or we'll say something like, you know, I've tried it, but I'm just not too big on the taste. Not my cup of tea. We dodge the subject. We come up with all sorts of excuses in order to avoid telling the actual reason for why we don't do something or why we do something. Why? Are we ashamed of being different from the world? Are we afraid of having hard conversations? Are we afraid of being put in uncomfortable positions where we have to explain who we are to people? Are we afraid the world won't love us anymore? That can't be the case, brethren. 2 Timothy 2:15 tells us to be diligent to present yourself approved to God as a worker who does not need to be ashamed, accurately handling the word of truth. Brethren, if we want to be able to stand before God on the day of judgment unashamedly, then we cannot be ashamed of standing against the world while we are here. When situations like this come up, we can't view them as something that we should be ashamed of, as something that we should run away from and be scared to tell the actual reason. We need to view them as opportunities because that is what they are. It's an opportunity for us to tell someone what God would have them to hear. Yes, I do this. No, I don't do this because God told me to. Let me tell you why you shouldn't or should either. We can use these as opportunities to introduce people to the gospel. We can use them as opportunities to plant a seed in someone that may bear fruit years down the road. And you know what? When we start viewing these things as opportunities and treating them like that, we are going to be put into difficult situations. We're going to be in uncomfortable situations. I know it's scary, but that's a part of being a Christian. And we are going to be viewed as different. But if that is what it takes to help someone to come to know the truth, then I hope and pray that each and every one of us would be willing to make that decision 10 times over. Micaiah was. And then, you know what? It wasn't just a one-time thing for Micaiah either, right? He didn't come to Ahab's mind because he'd come and told Ahab what he didn't want to hear one time. This was something that was happening frequently. He was coming before Ahab frequently and doing this time and time again, which means that not only was Micaiah not only always telling Ahab the truth, but he was also always unwilling to conform to the king's demands. And we see this illustrated for us in chapter 22, verse 13. When Jehoshaphat asked Ahab to fetch Micaiah for him, Ahab sends his messenger. And the messenger comes to summon Micaiah, and he says to him, I just lost my place. One moment. He says, Behold now, the words of the prophets are uniformly favorable to the king. Please let your word be like the word of one of them and speak favorably. And I love to imagine this moment right here because this isn't confirmed in Scripture, but it's something that I think is a safe thing for us to assume. This man has probably worked for Ahab for many years. And so as a result of that, he's probably been in this situation multiple times. He's probably seen Micaiah come into the king, tell him something the king didn't want to hear, something that goes against him, or just criticize him, and he's probably seen the results. Because if you'll remember who Ahab was a baby. Ahab was a baby. He's probably seen this man throw a tantrum. He's probably seen him get angry. He's probably seen him take it out on his servants. And so the messenger has all these things in mind when he's coming to get Micaiah. And so it's almost that when he gets here, it's like he's begging Micaiah, saying to him, just this one time, can't you tell him what he wants to hear? I mean, I know how you do, Micaiah, but can't you do differently this time? 400 people just told him what he wanted to hear. 400 people told him he'd be successful. 400 told him that he is in the right. Are you really going to oppose them now? He is begging Micaiah just this once, conform, tell the king what it is he wants to hear. And it seems easy enough, right? And in fact, it would have been easy for Micaiah because Micaiah and Ahab didn't get along. And if he conformed just this once, as we'll talk about later in the chapter, Ahab dies in this battle. So Micaiah really would have been doing this one time right here, but he didn't. And instead he responds to the man in verse 14 saying, As the Lord lives, what the Lord says to me, that I shall speak. And that's exactly what he does in 1 Kings 22, verse 17. When he goes to King Ahab and says this, I saw all Israel scattered on the mountains, like sheep which have no shepherd. And the Lord said, These have no master. Let each of them return to his house in peace. You see, Ahab wanted Micaiah to conform and to tell him the things that he wanted to hear, to tell him that he was in the right, but Micaiah wasn't willing to do this. And instead in verse 17, I know this is kind of cryptic language, but what he's telling him is you're going to die in battle. You're not going to be successful. You're going to die in battle, and all the people you take to battle with you will return home without a master and without a king. And the funny thing to me about this is that after Micaiah pronounces this judgment upon Ahab, Ahab turns to Jehoshaphat and he says, Did I not tell you that he would not prophesy good concerning me, but evil? And I find that ironic, because what Micaiah has just told Ahab here is probably the most loving thing that Ahab has heard all day. I talked about it before, but those 400 prophets who were telling Ahab what he wanted to hear, those people didn't care about Ahab. They didn't care about his heart. All they cared about was pleasing him for personal gain. Micaiah is caring about his heart right here. He is trying to save him from the death that he has awaiting him in this battle. He's trying to show him love. But as we talked about before, Ahab wasn't interested in love if it meant opposition to him. And so as a result of these things that Micaiah says, Ahab in verse 26 says, Take Micaiah and return him to Amon, the governor of the city, and to Joash the king's son. and say, "Thus says the king, put this man in prison and feed him sparingly with bread and water until I return safely." Rather than acknowledge that Micaiah just tried to save his life and tried to spare him of the death he had awaiting him, Ahab instead throws him into prison indefinitely. And I'm going to ask you, don't you think Micaiah knew this is what was going to happen coming in? As he's making his way to Ahab's palace, don't you think he knows there's a very good possibility that this is what's going to happen to him? Don't you think he'd recognize that he'd be punished for telling Ahab the truth, for telling him what God wanted him to hear? And not just punished, but that he would be thrown into prison indefinitely as a result of this. And as we've talked about, if you read further down into the chapter, you'll read that King Ahab never does return home from battle. He's struck with an arrow at random and he dies. And so it's safe for us to assume that as a result of the king's command and the events in that battle, Micaiah very well may never have gotten out of prison. He may have died in prison. And so what I conclude is that Micaiah went into this situation knowing fully well that by telling Ahab the truth and by refusing to conform to his demands, he would die. And if he knew he would die, why would he do it? Right? Because why would somebody do something if they know they're going to die as a result of it? And the reason for this is because he wanted to do God's will and not man's. He had the same mentality as Paul in Galatians 1 verse 10 when he said, "For am I now seeking the favor of men or of God? Or am I striving to please men? If I were trying to please men, I would not be a bondservant of Christ." You see, brethren, we as Christians need to be the same as both of these two men, and thus be concerned with one thing and one thing alone: doing God's will. Because what people today need more than anything is someone who will remain strong in their beliefs and not simply conform to the things that they want to hear. They don't need 400 prophets or 400 people coming to them and telling them that's perfectly fine if you do whatever you want, that God is okay with you pursuing whatever's in your heart. It's fine as long as you're happy. That's not what people need. People need to be told the truth. That's our responsibility as workers in God's harvest, to tell people the truth, to tell them the truth even if it's hard, to tell them the truth even if it results in our suffering, and to tell them the truth if even like Micaiah it results in our death. Because that is our job. Our job on this earth is to warn others of the trap that lays ahead of them. And that's exactly what Micaiah did. And that's the third thing that I notice about him. If we go back to the very beginning of this story and all throughout, what we can recognize is Ahab obviously did not care about Micaiah. And so with this in mind, don't you think that Micaiah would have a little hesitation with going and telling Ahab that he's going to die at the end of the day and potentially sparing his life? You would think so, but he doesn't. And he goes anyways, and he attempts to warn the king of what lays ahead of him. He tries to persuade him to listen to God, not to go to battle against Ramoth-Gilead, because it's going to result in his death. Brethren, is this not the same as what we're supposed to be doing with people in the world? Aren't we trying to warn them of what lies beyond this life for them if they continue to live in their sin? And we read some about this responsibility in Ezekiel chapter 3, if you'll turn over there. Ezekiel chapter 3. Actually, I give credit to Titus White for pointing this verse out to me after one of my previous lessons. But it's a great passage right here. And we read some about the responsibility that God has given us as people in his harvest. In Ezekiel chapter 3, starting verse 16, Ezekiel receives a charge from the Lord. It says, "At the end of 7 days, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, I have appointed you a watchman to the house of Israel. Whenever you hear a word from my mouth, warn them from me. When I say to the wicked, you will surely die, and you do not warn him or speak out to warn the wicked from his wicked way, that he may live, that wicked man shall die in his iniquity, but his blood I will require at your hand." Now this is a terrifying verse. And I don't know about y'all, but it terrifies me to think about God requiring people's blood at my hand. And the reason for this is because if you're like me, you have far too often not made it plainly obvious that you're one of God's people. Or you've just allowed one of these opportunities to pass you by and made no sort of effort to preach the gospel to someone. And I think about all these people and these opportunities that I've allowed to pass me by. And it terrifies me to think about them being condemned on the day of judgment, knowing that I could have made a difference. I could have done something. I could have said something to them that would have potentially pricked their hearts so that they would not receive this condemnation. In Acts 20, verse 26, Paul says, "Therefore I testify to you this day that I am innocent of the blood of all men. For I did not shrink from declaring to you the whole purpose of God." If we, like Paul, want to be innocent of the blood of all men, then we, like Paul, must declare to others the whole purpose of God. And when we think about this, we obviously think about Mark 16:15, where we're to go into the world and to preach the gospel to people. And that's right. We are to go in the world and preach the gospel to people. But that's not where it stops. We're not just going out and telling people the good news of Jesus Christ. We're also telling them how deceitful sin is. Because, brethren, in the same way that Ramoth-Gilead appeared as some incredible thing to King Ahab, sin is the same to the world. It says it's got so many positives. It offers so many benefits. It offers so many things. I'll make your life better. But like Ramoth-Gilead, it is just a trap. It's a trap, though, with far greater consequences. Because while Ramoth-Gilead led to King Ahab's physical death, sin leads to our spiritual death. And I don't care who you are, none of us should want to see even our worst enemy have to experience something like that on the day of judgment. And so it's our responsibility, brethren. It's our responsibility to be like Micaiah and make every effort possible to warn these people of this, even if they will not heed our warning. Because as Paul says in 2 Timothy 2, starting in verse 2, "I solemnly charge you in the presence of God and of Christ Jesus, who is to judge the living and the dead, and by his appearing in his kingdom, preach the word. Be ready in season and out of season. Reprove, rebuke, exhort with great patience and instruction." And get this, "For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but wanting to have their ears tickled, they will accumulate for themselves teachers in accordance to their own desires, and will turn away their ears from the truth, and will turn aside to myths. But you, be sober in all things, endure hardship, do the work of an evangelist, fulfill your ministry." The reason that this lesson is so important to us today is because, brethren, this is our reality. When I look out into the world, unfortunately, what I see more times than not is people who want to be told that what they're doing is right, that God is perfectly fine with what they're doing, that there's no problem whatsoever with satisfying the desires of the flesh. And unfortunately, on top of that, there are far more prophets of Ahab who are telling them that this is perfectly fine, that there's no problem with this, than there are prophets of the Lord. And with that in mind, brethren, how much more of a problem then is it for us as the prophets of the Lord to not fulfill our duty of warning the world of what's to come? And so ultimately, brethren, short lesson, but my question for you tonight is, which of the two are you going to be? Which one are you going to be? Are you going to be like the prophets of Ahab? Are you going to conform to the world? Are you going to be afraid to share the truth with others and tell them what God would have them to hear? Or are you going to remove yourself from the Lord's work? Because whether you realize it or not, if you're removing yourself from God's work and sitting idly doing nothing, you are no better than the prophets of Ahab. And I'm preaching to myself just as much as anyone else right now. Or are we going to be like Micaiah? Will we refuse to conform to the world? Will we continuously work for the Lord? Will we stand for God's truth even if it costs us everything, even if it costs us our life? Because as Jesus says in Matthew 16, verse 22, "If anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul?" Brethren, though this passage does not just apply to evangelism, it applies to our salvation as well. If you've not been baptized tonight, then I have a question for you. Are you willing to risk eternal damnation by not making things right with God right now? And if you have been baptized but have not been living the way you ought to, then my question remains the same. Because, brethren, baptism is only the beginning of our journey with Christ. It's not the be-all, do-all. It is just the beginning. After it, our life is supposed to look like Micaiah's. It's supposed to be one of consistent, constant, and unashamed service to the Lord in which we are living for Him every single day. And so if you've not been doing a good job of these things, if you want to make things right, whatever your need may be, I encourage you to make it right tonight by coming forward as we stand and as we sing.